how does the brain do all of the amazing things that it actually does? So, of course, it's long been known that different parts of the brain have different functions. And when we talk about neuroanatomy in psychology, we're actually most interested in what are the functions of different areas. Not so much in all their anatomic labels and landmarks, but where are particular functions localized to the brain? So what do the different regions of the brain actually do? And so here we're going to have a look at the major divisions of the brain, the major lobes and primary areas in terms of their function. So I want to start first actually with the primary areas of the brain. They're divided amongst the main 4 lobes of the brain. Primary areas are the areas usually the first site of input into the brain, usually from our senses, or the last stage of output from the brain before it goes down the spinal cord. And so we have primary areas for our senses of vision, touch, and hearing. So in the back of the brain here we have primary visual cortex, where all input from the eyes, from the retina and the eyes, goes first to the back of the brain into primary visual cortex. And any damage or neurons that don't function in the visual cortex means we're actually left with a blind spot in our visual field, a part of vision that we just can't see. We have also primary area for our sense of hearing, for audition, located in the temporal lobe, actually close to the ears. So the first input from the cochlea in the ears for sense of hearing goes to primary auditory cortex. We have a primary area for our sense of touch, primary sensory cortex. There's a major landmark that runs down the center of the brain here called the central sulcus. And on the posterior part, the back part of the central sulcus, is the primary sensory cortex. And that's responsible for all of our sense of touch. So any touch in the body, from touch sensors on our skin, goes up the spinal cord and enters first here in the brain at primary sensory cortex. And any damage to primary sensory cortex, if neurons there stop functioning, we'll actually lose our sense of touch in part of our body, becomes numb. The last primary area is actually the main output part of the brain, the primary motor cortex, and it lies just on the anterior side of the central sulcus, here, just in front of the central sulcus. And primary motor cortex is the last place where neurons there will fire their signals that go down the spinal cord and cause muscle contraction. So primary motor cortex is responsible for all contraction of muscles in our body for voluntary movement, so controlling all body movement. And any damage or lesion to primary motor cortex will lead to a paralysis in that part of the body we just cannot move. So primary area is incredibly important as the first site of input to the brain or the last site of output from the brain, as in the primary motor cortex. And as I said, these lie within the 4 major lobes of the brain. So we'll go through the 4 lobes of the brain and a quick overview of their function. So starting with the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe in the front of the brain is really responsible for all our complex human behavior. A whole lot of functions we lump together and call executive functions. All our abilities for reasoning, planning, problem solving. A really important function called inhibitory control, and that is important for regulation of appropriate behavior. So we always have sort of biological drives or other urges or desires, and in selecting appropriate behavior, we need to, one is select what's appropriate, and the other is inhibit competing alternatives. They might be habitual ways that we respond, some of our habits. They might be biologically driven kind of urges. And often these need to be inhibited to select appropriate behavior. And so many neuropsychiatric disorders involve some deficits in this inhibitory control, where we see sort of compulsive or obsessive or inappropriate behaviors with a lack of inhibitory control. Of course, the primary motor cortex is also located in the frontal lobes, so frontal lobes also have this motor function. And an important part of speech production, Production of speech also involves movement, and an area called Broca's area for production of speech is in the frontal lobes. Just sitting posterior to the frontal lobes is the parietal lobe, and the parietal lobe, together with the frontal lobe, this really is the major volume of the human brain. And both frontal and parietal areas are a very large volume in human brain and very highly evolved in us as humans compared with other species. And really together control a lot of the way that we act and interact within the world and the space around us. So the parietal lobe, well, it contains primary sensory cortex, so it has sensory functions, but really its main function is around the sense of space that we have of the world around us. And it basically is what builds us a stable representation of the world around us, mostly from our vision. So if you think about the kind of signal that comes into our brain from our eyes are constantly moving, our body's moving around the environment, our vision is always shifting. So as if you could imagine taking your mobile phone on a video setting and just waving your phone around in space, you would see this moving kind of image of the world. And that's essentially what's coming into our brain from our eyes that are constantly moving. And it's in our parietal lobe that we take that kind of messy moving image from our eyes and is built into a representation of a stable world around us. And that's what we perceive. So our perception is of a world that's not moving, and we have a sense of where objects are located around us. And so parietal lobe in this way plays an incredibly important role in linking vision also to action, giving us a sense of space around us, where things are located, and really mediating this amazing ability that we have as humans to interact and manipulate objects around us using tools, and more than any other species, we as humans have had this incredible capacity to change and influence the world around us through this linking of vision with complex fine control of movement and interacting with objects and the environment around us. Parietal lobe. Moving more posterior in the brain, the occipital lobe is the location of primary visual cortex, and really it's responsible for all of our sense of vision. So input from the retina and the front of the eyes goes first to the back of the brain into primary visual cortex, and from there actually our perception, our visual perception, is processed through different kind of modules in the visual cortex. We actually have different brain regions within the occipital lobe, different groups of neurons that each process different parts of a visual scene around us, different characteristics from vision. So there are some areas that are particularly sensitive to colour and give us a perception of colour of objects around us, and different areas that are very sensitive to motion, detecting movement and give us our perception of moving objects. There are other groups of neurons that process shape, particularly shape of edges between light and dark or between colours. And our perception of objects, being able to identify an object separate from its background, relies on this ability to detect edges. The edges really, the boundaries of an object are really what identify that object separated from its background. And we have specialised areas in the visual cortex to do that. So visual perception in us as humans, highly complex, and this kind of modular system where different groups of neurons are each kind of detectors for different parts of vision. As we move into the temporal lobe on the side is the location of our primary auditory cortex, has a major role in sense of audition, as well as language and our ability to comprehend speech and language. So an important area in the temporal lobe called Wernicke's area, important for ability to comprehend language and speech. Another very important structure on the inside surface of the temporal lobe, say the medial temporal lobe, is the limbic system, containing areas important for learning and memory, the amygdala and hippocampus. Now, it's a really important area of the brain and hidden sort of on the inside surface of the temporal lobe. So the medial temporal lobe contains these structures, the amygdala and hippocampus. The amygdala seems to be particularly important for alerting us to things that are threatening in the environment. So if we put people in the MRI scanner where we can see brain activity in response to particular events, we show people pictures of scary things like snakes and spiders, or angry or fearful faces, often things that signify threat or danger in our environment. The amygdala becomes highly active. And we think this kind of functions as a kind of alerting system in the brain. It's very rapid to activate and alerts us to potential threat or danger in the environment. And it's linked really closely with the hippocampus. The hippocampus, we know, plays a really important role in memory and in learning. And we know that from some studies of patients who've had parts of the hippocampus damaged or removed, which leads to very serious amnesia and antegrade amnesia, so a deficit in forming new memories. And so together, amygdala and hippocampus serve this really important role of learning, and together with the amygdala, particularly learning from past situations of danger or threat, and perhaps play a role in phobias, which can be a kind of an excessive or an unhelpful sort of associational learning between something that may be threatening or fearful. So the last structure to talk about is the corpus callosum, is the main area that interconnects between left and right hemispheres. And it's the corpus callosum that really allows the communication between left and right hemispheres. So it's the site where the output arm of neurons, axons, will cross from one hemisphere to the other and allow communication between neurons in the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And we actually know a lot about the individual functions of left hemisphere and right hemisphere by study of patients who've had their corpus callosum surgically cut. This has been done as a treatment for epilepsy, can stop the spread of epileptic seizures from one hemisphere to the other, but leaves the left and the right hemispheres disconnected and unable to communicate with each other. And through study of these patients, we actually learned a lot about the individual functions of left and right hemispheres. So that's an overview of the major lobes of the brain, the frontal, parietal, occipital and temporal lobes, and the associated primary areas of the brain, and the integrated function across all these regions is what gives rise to our complex human behaviour.